Welcome back. In our last session, we talked about the archaeology and Bible, how the two mesh, how they don't mesh, where they conflict, where they don't, and why. We talked a little bit about chronological frameworks of both fields. And now what I want to do is take a case study. And in this case, we're going to take one of the earlier portions of the biblical text from the book of Genesis, the patriarchal narrative, and we're going to look at how archaeology informs the narrative, how it works, how it doesn't, why and why not. So let's take off. According to the biblical chronology, the patriarchal narrative should take place around 1951 to 1700 BCE. Note how precise that is, because the biblical chronology does endeavor to be precise about these kinds of things. It turns out that it's not so straightforward, as you will see. Archaeologically, we have our periods, our periodization, that we divide our material culture into Bronze Age, Iron Age, and then into historical periods, Persian, Hellenistic, etc. For our purposes, the biblical text mostly would reference the Bronze Age and the Iron Age into the Persian period. Let's start with the biblical text, with the book of Genesis, chapter 12, the first verses, the parasha that is known as Lech Lecha, where God says to Abraham, go away from your land to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you great. So, according to the narrative, Abraham and his family go up out of Ur and migrate to Canaan. This is the route that has been reconstructed from the south, Ur of the Chaldees, going all the way up to the north along the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys into what is now eastern Turkey, northern Syria, and then cutting south to the land of Canaan. One of the issues already is that, historically speaking, Ur of the Chaldees doesn't really exist in the early second millennium BCE. The Chaldean kingdom is a kingdom of the first millennium BCE, which is sort of a hint that whoever wrote the story down wrote it when this kingdom existed, and that perhaps there's something else going on here with a place called Ur. After the leaving of Ur, Abraham arrives at Haran. We know where Haran is. It still has its name. It is in southeastern Turkey of today. It has some very old remains in and around it. Here you have these structures made of mud brick with cone-shaped roofs that go way back hundreds and hundreds of years. This is all disappearing. Everybody in Turkey is now building with cinder blocks and plasterboard and things like that. But it's a very ancient place. Its name is preserved. And it makes sense that would be a place in the second millennium BCE that someone would visit. Now, the question is, how historical is this narrative? Is there anything in archaeology that would suggest that the patriarchal narrative reflects an historical event? And so we'll take a look here. Especially in the second millennium, late third millennium BCE. So if we, for example, look at what cities looked like in these ancient times, we look at fortifications in cities. On the left, we have the site of Ebla. To the right, we have the site of Hama. And fortifications that are massive, made of massive ramparts of layers of soil and brick and all kinds of technological innovations that existed in the late third and early second millennium BCE. And this is in Syria and in Mesopotamia. And here we are at Tel Aviv on the coast, northern coast of Israel. We have a very similar construction of a rampart that dates to the 18th, early 17th century BCE, with the same kind of layers that surrounded the site of ancient Akko, which is outside of modern Akko. And it looks like it's a similar technique. And we have the same kind of thing observable at Tel Chatzor, where we have a massive rampart that encloses a huge site on the left, And then we have an acropolis, which is at the bottom of the site of the slide to your left. And to the right, you see a picture showing the way that the rampart was constructed using multiple layers, masses of mud brick walling, support walls, and the like. This is a system that was invented in Mesopotamia, in Syria, in the 3rd millennium BC, and arrives in the southern Levant circa 1800, maybe even 1900 BCE. So there's some kind of transfer of technology and information going on in this early period. The same could be said about gates. So this is a model of the gate that was excavated at Tel Dan in the 1970s and early 1980s. Here's what it looks like today, more or less. It's actually in a little better shape now. It is a gate that is completely made of mud bricks. It has a vaulted, arched entryway, which was later filled in already very soon after it was made. It has 2 towers on either side, and there are interior bays to the right and to the left when you enter and you go into the city. This is completely made of mud brick on a stone sokol or foundation. Our ceramics date this gate to about 1750 or so BCE. It's being reconstructed. It is a candidate for UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can see how the restorers of the National Parks Authority are reconstructing parts of it. The interior is completely original. You can see the original mud bricks, which are 3,700 years old. And this is a very Syrian technique, using different colors of mud brick, encasing them in harder mud bricks. And it's something that the restorers had to learn how to do and follow the method. Here's the interior gateway going down into the city. And to the right, you can see a plan of the gate with its 4 chambers, 2 on each side, as you enter and then go down to the other side. Now, the thing with this gate is that we found perhaps 24 identifiable diagnostic ceramic shards and maybe a total of 120 shards from the Middle Bronze Age dating to circa 1800, 1700 BCE, and that was it. And that's very, very little for a monumental structure of this kind. You would have expected thousands of shards to come out from the staircase, from within the bricks, inside the chambers, and there was very little material in there. Not only that, when you look at the picture on the left, and you can see sort of a bunch of soil to the right of the woman that's standing on the staircase, and you see a stone sheathing that protected or retained that soil, it's very clear that this is a soil collapse that went down into the mud on top of the stairs and blocked entry into the city to some extent. And rather than clearing it away, they just tried to protect it or block it off so that it wouldn't collapse anymore, so that people could still come into the town. In addition to that, the towers themselves seem to be falling away from the core. They were breaking apart. In later seasons of excavation that we did about 15 years ago, we found that the mud bricks from the outer layer were detached from the inner section of the gate. So it looks like this gate was falling apart. And very soon thereafter, it was completely covered up and engaged within the soil stone rampart on either side, and the gate was canceled and moved somewhere else, probably around 1750 or 1700 BCE. And it was in use for a very short period of time. Now the question then that is asked is, why did this happen? Did these people not know what was going to happen to this gate? Did they not know how to build a gate? Well, I think the key is that this gate is a Syrian-style gate, a Mesopotamian-style gate. Here's the gate from Katna in the drawing from this from a book about architecture. Here's the lower right-hand corner circled in red is a gate from a Syrian site called Katna. It looks almost exactly the same and has almost exactly the same dimensions as the Tel Dan gate, as you can see. And here is a gate from a site called Tel Mumbakat on the Euphrates River in Syria. Note the mud brick vault, the arch. We used to think that the Romans invented the arch, but that's not true. It was invented in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BCE because in Mesopotamia you do not have any building stone. So bricks take the place of stone. And if you want to cover a space, a passageway, a gateway, you invent an arch. And that's what the Mesopotamians and Syrians did. But this was not a technology that was native to the southern Levant, to ancient Israel. It was imported here. In Mesopotamia and in Syria, in the Euphrates and Tigris River plains, you get maybe 100, 150 millimeters of rainfall a year, which means that a brick structure is going to hold together with frequent replasterings. In the Mediterranean climate zone, where Tel Dan is located, for example, you have 700 millimeters of rainfall a year, and in winter it's quite torrential. So this mud brick gate that was constructed at Tel Dan did not hold up. It started falling apart very quickly. That's why there's so little pottery in there, because within a year or two, it wasn't holding together. And so the city fathers decided to completely cover the thing up and make another gate on the southern side of the site made of stone. So the question then is, were the architects stupid? Didn't they know how to build a gate in a Mediterranean zone? Well, the answer is probably that these people who used this technology and this architecture came from the north, where it was normative, where you didn't have to worry about torrential rains because the rainfall was much less. And they built what they knew how to build at Tel Dan, but very soon realized that it wasn't going to work. This is evidence, I think, of people migrating from the north, using native technologies that were maladapted to a Mediterranean climate. Moreover, the mud brick arch is a Mesopotamian technology. It's very clearly not native to the land of Canaan or Israel. So Abraham journeys from Ur via Haran. There is, by the way, a place in eastern Turkey called Urfa, right next to Haran, and many scholars today feel that the Ur of the Chaldees is an anachronism, and in fact, Abraham's journey originated in eastern Turkey in the area of Urfa, made a stop in nearby Haran, and then went south to Canaan. Mud bricks. Here is a Druze worker from the Golan Heights who is using molds to make mud bricks. The mud bricks of the same size that were used in the Tel Dan gate. They are very similar to the sizes of mud bricks in some of the Syrian buildings that we know from archaeology. Here's a whole bunch of them that were created, left to dry out over several months in order to reconstruct the Tel Dan mud brick gate, which is in the national park, Dan today. One of the things that is interesting in the text references bricks. When the Tower of Babel is being built, the idea of building with brick instead of stone is seen by the biblical author as something that is worthy of remark. We're not going to use stone. They're building something with brick, and it's going to reach the heavens. This is the story of the Tower of Babel and everything that goes with that story. Here's Bruegel's vision of what the Tower of Babel would have looked like. Of course, it's quite fanciful. But the author of this text is probably referencing a monumental structure that was current in Mesopotamia in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE, even into the 1st millennium BCE, the ziggurat, which is a massive tower structure which has a huge base and is accessed by a very monumental staircase. These existed, for example, at Babylon. Here's a map reconstructed of the site of Babylon after its excavations in the 19th and 20th century BC. The ziggurat is one of those red buildings in the center right next to the Euphrates River. The word Babel comes from an ancient Semitic word, bab, which means gate, as it does in Arabic today, ili, which means gods. It means literally the gate of the gods. And in the picture here, you can see the reconstruction of the Ishtar gate
at the Vorderasiatische Museum in Berlin, which is now closed for renovations. But this gate was excavated and then transported to Berlin and reconstructed. This emblem is emblematic of the name of the site, Babylon, Bab Ilu. Here's a staircase on the left-hand side going up to the ziggurat, in this case the reconstructed ziggurat at Ur. There are a number of scholars who feel that the Sulam in Genesis, Jacob's ladder, Sulam Yaakov, is in fact not a ladder, but Sulam actually means staircase, and that the biblical authors, referencing things like the Tower of Babylon, the ziggurat, were actually envisioning a staircase that goes up to the top of the ziggurat. The purpose of the ziggurat was to reach closer to the heavens. The priests in Mesopotamia would ascend the ziggurat, communicate with the gods, and then bring down the message to the people down below. This was part of a ritual process. So when you're talking about Jacob's ladder, maybe it should be better translated as Jacob's staircase. Another feature of daily life and of people's lives everywhere is burial. The common burial practices in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC were chamber tombs. Here is a chamber tomb that was excavated at Jericho in the 1950s, where the preservation was absolutely fantastic. Wooden beds, wooden bowls, all kinds of organic materials, baskets, things like that preserved, including foodstuffs. And here you can see a skeleton, one of a number, the last skeleton, the last body that was buried in this family tomb, with other parts of skeletons put off to the side, moved, to make room for the most recent one. This tomb dates to about 1650 or so BCE. It's one of many that were found at Jericho. So it is the typical kind of local Canaanite-style tomb, a chamber tomb carved out of the bedrock. This is what you would find in the early Bronze Age, and then again in the Middle Bronze Age into the Late Bronze Age. So say from 3,500 to about 1200 BCE, this is the kind of tomb that was normative for people in the southern Levant. Here's another example. This was a tomb that was excavated right next to the Biblical Zoo in Jerusalem. There is a whole Bronze Age cemetery. A number of the houses in the neighborhood of Malcha are built over this cemetery. The Israel Antiquities Authority excavated this over a number of years. This is a picture I took about 20 years ago while it was being excavated. Here's a drawing, a cross-section of a drawing of a chamber tomb like this, which was found in the Tel Aviv harbor area, northern Tel Aviv, excavated by Yaakov Kaplan in the 1950s. You have an access shaft, and then you have a chamber which has all the burial goods and the dead inside. It's very clear that these people believed that you needed to be provisioned for the netherworld, for the next life. When you die, it's not the end of everything, there's another phase. And so people had to be provided for. And this is, again, normative throughout the southern Levant in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. So you have a whole series of tombs that are found in the Middle Bronze Age. The typical kind is the one in the upper left-hand corner, as I've showed you a few slides of, but that's the typical kind, the shaft tomb. But all the rest of these are newly introduced in the Middle Bronze Age. These are all from Tel Dan. There are chamber tombs that are constructed beneath the floors of houses. They're inside the city. Underneath the living room, grandma and grandpa were buried together with their kids. You also have young children, not babies, but young children, buried in cisterns underneath the floors of houses. And you have infants that are buried, and even fetuses, buried in jars underneath the floors of houses, probably with the idea that they're going to be reborn into the family. These are generally individuals that are less than 2 years of age. They're almost always buried in a fetal position. My feeling is that this is to replicate rebirth, that the tomb is conceived of as the womb, and the individual is going to be reborn into the family at some point in time. So all of these are newly introduced in the Middle Bronze Age. They did not exist in the early Bronze Age in Canaan.
Here's an infant burial from Tel Dan. You can see, if you can probably make out the fetal position. By the way, the head almost always faces the opening, the direction of parutition. When a baby is born, that's the position, the ideal position. Here we have a slide from the site of Ur in southern Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq. Under the floor of a house, a series of jar burials and crater burials containing infants. This is something that already exists in Mesopotamia and Syria in the 3rd millennium BCE, continues into the 2nd millennium BCE. So it's a practice that precedes its appearance in the southern Levant. Here is a chamber tomb from Tel Dan that dates to about 1700 BCE, with complete vessels lined up on a bench in the back. These are on display still in the Skirball Museum in Jerusalem on King David Street. Here is another sampling of objects found in another tomb at Tel Dan, showing the kind of provisioning that was left for the dead. Perfumes, weapons, jewelry, shanks of meat, you name it, they had everything they needed for the next life. And this is, again, fairly normative in the Bronze Age, especially in the Middle Bronze Age and early part of the Late Bronze Age. Here is a chamber tomb, also made of corbelled vaulting or arches from a site called Khafajeh in northern Iraq. It's a chamber tomb. It's much earlier than the one at Tel Dan, but it's the same idea and has the same kinds of vessels inside. Here's another one from further south in Syria, a site called Tel Khadidi. This is later. This is 2300 BCE. And here is one of the tombs from Tel Dan that dates to about 1850 BCE. It's almost exactly the same style. So there's something going on here where you have burial techniques of different kinds that originate in Syria and Mesopotamia and reach the southern Levant, the land of Canaan, circa 1900 or so BCE. And this sort of brings us to the parasha that's called Chayei Sarah, the death of Sarah in the book of Genesis. We all know about the story about how Abraham wants a place to bury his family's dead, because these are family tombs. When Sarah dies, he negotiates with a Hittite. The Hittites are living up there in the hill country, and Abraham says, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Now, bear in mind, who are the Hittites? Hittites are people that come from Turkey. The biblical writer wants us to know this, right? And Abraham asked to buy a burial plot for his family. And this burial plot happens to be at the edge of a field of the Hittites. And Abraham wants to buy it, and the Hittite says, Ephron the Hittite says, you know what? I'm going to give it to you because you're great and you're wonderful and we want good relations. And Abraham insists on buying the plot. By the way, we have ancient texts from Ugarit and Mari that talk about the purchasing of burial plots under houses when people move house. So in the end, Abraham does not agree. He insists on paying good money. There's a contract made, and that becomes Abraham's family's burial place for generations. Now, this whole story is critical because it is referencing, first of all, a practice that the people who wrote this text knew about, the idea of burying your dead in a family vault carved out of stone, usually not far away from the fields. Ideologically, theologically, there's another issue here, to my mind at least, and I think that what this story is telling us is that the presence of the Hebrews that have migrated from somewhere else, from Mesopotamia, or perhaps Eastern Turkey, are given a legal tender over this plot of land. Once you bury your dead in a place, in a lot of ways it becomes yours. You have an anchor, it's legitimate, here's my contract, I paid for it. In a way, this sort of harkens forward in time to present day, where law and contracts determine who owns something, without getting too political about it. And this, of course, is the site of Machpelah. the Cave of Machpelah, which was later identified and built over with a monumental building I'll show you in a second. What does the word Machpelah mean? It means a multiplication of something, a doubling up of something. A lot of the burial tombs that we know from the land of Canaan, from the Bronze Age, are not just one chamber like I showed you from the tomb in Tel Aviv. A lot of times there are 2 or 3 or even 4 chambers that go off from the central chamber as the family expands. They carve more chambers in order to add more dead. And that's probably the meaning of the Cave of Machpelah, where there are more than one chamber accessible from within the tomb. I can go forward. Here is the structure that was built in the Herodian period and the Roman period, built over the Machpelah. It was already a revered, hallowed site in the time of the Mishnah. And here again is another picture of that tomb from Emek Raphaim, around outside of Jerusalem, where you can see the remains of pots that are being excavated in situ in the excavation. So the slide that you see in front of you is of an archaeological Tel Ara, which has never been excavated. You can see some of the village houses that are climbing up to the Tel, but not on the top. It's located in Wadi Ara. This was excavated by Tel Aviv University in the early 2000s. And here you can see the multiple chambers that I was talking about regarding the Machpelah, branching out from the central chamber. Here is a sampling of objects that were found in this tomb. Hundreds of pottery vessels, metal weapons, jewelry, scarab seals, and the lot. This is what happens when you find a tomb that has not been plundered in antiquity. Here's another example of one of these chamber tombs from Ephrata in the Judean mountains, with some of the objects that were found in that tomb. It's a shaft tomb, just like the one we saw before. If we go further north into Syria, leaving the topic of burial and segueing into something else, the site of Ebla is a massive, huge site, a beautiful site in Syria. Perhaps now it'll become accessible again after many years of warfare in Syria. Excavated by an Italian expedition under the direction of Paolo Mattie, which contains all kinds of things which look really quite similar to what we have in Israel in a lot of ways, the monumental architecture. Here's the site looking south towards Damascus. Ebla in the 3rd millennium BC was an empire. It had a large extent with borders reaching up into northern Mesopotamia. Perhaps the most important thing about Ebla was the discovery of an archive of tens of thousands of cuneiform letters written in an ancient Semitic text and language, an early form of sort of Akkadian. It's called Eblaetic. Here's a slide of some of the tablets that were found in the library. They would have been located on shelves, placed in an organized way. And with the destruction of Ebla, circa 2500, a little bit later, the library collapsed, the wood burned away, and you're left with all these inscriptions. Here's an example of one of them. They contain all kinds of wondrous information, the politics, the economics of the time, the trade. We know about weights and measures from these texts. We know about the international relations with places like Mari, with places like Ur, extensive connections with the coast as well. Probably it's possible that even Hatzor is mentioned in one of these, although that would be a later text, and it's more relevant for Mari, for another major site. What's very interesting about some of these texts is that there are place names and personal names that we recognize in the lexicon of the Ebla library. So places like Akko, Dor, and Ashdod, and Hatzor, they're mentioned. It might not be the exact same places that we know, but the terms are already recognizable. Hatzor, for example, there are a number of Hatzors. Hatzor comes from the word Chatzer, which means a large open expanse, which is usually fenced in or blocked in. And so there are a number of places that have the word Hatzor throughout
Western Asia in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. So the term might not refer to Hatzor in Israel, but again, it's a cognate, it's a word that appears in our Northwest Semitic language. Ashdod, Dor, again, they might not be the places that we know in Israel, but they are terms that are already recognizable. And the same goes with names. Abram is mentioned. We have something that looks like David, Esav, Ishmael, etc. These are words that seem to appear in the Ebla letters already in the late 3rd millennium BCE. The point being that already in the late 3rd millennium BC, there is contact between the southern Levant and the northern Levant, and there is information being exchanged, technologies being exchanged, a lot of it coming from north to south. So, what I've showed you is a series of items, articles, data, which reference which reference archaeology, and which reference connections between the north and the south. And if we go back to the biblical text, I also showed you some texts which seem to reference this kind of movement of material culture and ideas. The patriarchal narrative, is it historical or not? One thing that is very clear is that populations, traders, and others traveled back and forth between Mesopotamia and Canaan in antiquity. This happened all the time. It wasn't just in one particular period of time. The patriarchal narrative could actually fit archaeologically, historically, lots of different times. It could fit the early Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age. It could fit 2500 BCE, 1800 BCE, or 1200 BCE. People moved back and forth, sometimes including entire clans. That did happen. We have evidence of that outside the biblical text. The text in Genesis contains a number of anachronisms. So, for example, camels that are mentioned in the patriarchal narrative. From what we can tell, the camel only appears in Israel circa 1200 or so BCE, which does not align with the patriarchal narrative's internal chronology in the biblical text. They perhaps were introduced from Arabia or from eastern Syria or something like that. That's when they first appear archaeologically in Israel. So the camel does not appear to be a beast of burden in the 3rd or early 2nd millennium BCE. You have the same in Egypt. It doesn't appear at all until much later. So this seems to be an anachronism. Philistines are mentioned in the patriarchal narrative. The Philistines appear on the scene archaeologically, and that we'll talk about in the next talk when we talk about Tel Dan and the Danites. The Philistines only really appear archaeologically circa 1150 or so BCE. So again, looking at the chronology of the patriarchal narrative, that's much too early for when Philistines were actually in place. In addition to that, a lot of times place names which appear later don't jive with the earlier place names that should be the case. So for example, when Abraham chases after the kings who kidnapped his nephew Lot in the book of Genesis, he reaches Dan. And he reaches Dan and he saves his kidnapped nephew and brings him back south and defeats the northern kings who had abducted him. But in fact, if you move forward into the book of Judges, Judges 18, the tribe of Dan migrates northwards and they come to a place which is called Laish, not Dan, and they put it to the sword, they take it for themselves, and then they call it Dan. So it's another example of an anachronistic name which went out of place when the biblical authors and editors wrote down the text. They made a few errors here and there. So the text as we know it was written down later, and it was compiled of probably multiple stories. There are also a number of early elements in the patriarchal narrative. For example, God's name is not Yahweh, it's El, which is earlier. It's the ancient Canaanite name of the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. Before Yahweh comes into place. So that's an early element in the text.
And also the idea of socially mobile pastoralists, semi-nomads who live mostly off of sheep and goat. That's also something that's somewhat anachronistic. It's more characteristic of the Bronze Age. In the Iron Age, there's more an urban pastoral symbiosis going on. It's both. It's not just nomads who are wandering. The patriarchal narrative appears to contain a core of historicity, but that's probably it. The names appear in different places in different times. As we said before, in a number of different ways, there are resonances, echoes of things that happened, migrations and things like that. And I would say it's probably a core of historicity, but not necessarily literally true from one place to another. A lot of things changed, a lot of things were added, a lot of things were edited in that text and in those stories. It's multiple stories. And I think the bottom line here is that Genesis is a theological treatise. It's meant to explain the common origins of the universe, humankind, Israel itself, and to establish Israel's claim to the land of Israel. History, in a way, is created in order to do this. Thank you.